Since the world first learned to split the atom, nuclear energy has been a source of immense hope and of lingering fear. By any human metric, the potential of nuclear power is all but limitless, with the potential for just a few hundred modern reactors to supply carbon-free energy to an entire continent at a time. Yet fears of catastrophic nuclear meltdown, long-standing concerns over radioactive waste, and the undeniable connection between world-changing nuclear energy and world-ending nuclear weapons have long kept planet Earth from a true nuclear revolution. But what if a new approach to nuclear energy came along and changed the game? What if, not by magic or by miracle, but by straightforward nuclear physics, an atomic scientist near you promised that with the wave of a hand and a few $1 billion for research, they could provide a safer, cleaner, more peaceful alternative to the nuclear power industry that we've known for so long? This isn't some new uranium isotope. It's not some new element from the depths of the periodic table, and it's not nuclear fusion. It's thorium, an alternative fuel that many nuclear scientists believe to be not just a gateway to a massively improved nuclear industry, but a bridge between modern power infrastructure and a nuclear fusion revolution that's still decades away. Unlike fusion, thorium is ready now, and if the world can put theory into practice, then a whole lot of things are about to change. So, meet thorium. It's element number 90 on the periodic table, sandwiched between a couple of elements the average person has never heard of, and for most of human history, thorium's been just another rock. First discovered in 1828, thorium is relatively abundant. It's a silvery substance that can be extracted in small amounts from most rocks and sands. It exists in nature in one single form, and while that form is technically unstable, it decays slowly enough that its half-life is multiple times the current age of the planet. It's also used in light bulbs, high refractive camera lenses, and ceramics, and it's named after the Norse god of thunder, Thor. But the thing that makes thorium special is its properties relative to an element that the world has gotten to know a little bit better over the last century: uranium. Thorium is situated just 2 spots away from uranium on the periodic table, and unlike uranium, thorium is not a material that can be useful as a nuclear fuel. Its only naturally occurring isotope, thorium-232, is fissionable, but it's not fissile. That is to say, it's an atom that is more difficult to split in a nuclear reaction than uranium is. To get it to split, you've got to bombard it with high-energy neutrons, irradiating it until a fissile reaction finally takes place. Uranium-235, the fissile isotope of uranium that fuels nuclear power plants and nuclear bombs, is far easier to trigger into nuclear fission. But when thorium is irradiated with sufficient energy to cause a fission reaction, it produces a different isotope of uranium than the isotopes that the modern nuclear industry relies on. Instead, the so-called fertile isotope, thorium-232, can be used to create an artificial uranium isotope, uranium-233. While it's the thorium fuel cycle that we're discussing today, it's this special sort of uranium, a byproduct of the fissile reaction, that nuclear scientists are really after. As for why it might be better to pursue nuclear power via thorium's fuel cycle than uranium's, well, we'll be diving deep on that in just a moment. But before we do, here are some of the highlights. Thorium is far easier to obtain, it's much more abundant, it creates much safer byproducts, and it is far harder to put the byproducts of a thorium fuel cycle into a nuclear bomb. With those sorts of advantages, it's pretty easy to see why thorium would generate some curiosity around the world, but the mere fact that thorium reactors are a hot topic in the 2020s doesn't mean that they're a new concept. In fact, several nations, particularly the United States, have known about the potential value of thorium for decades, and the reason why it hasn't been adopted is nothing to do with efficacy. You see, thorium reactors were first worked out conceptually during the boom years of nuclear science in the decade or two after the conclusion of the Second World War. Around that time, scientists in the US were hard at work building uranium-based nuclear reactors with the fuel and potential to do more than turn the lights on. They also created the isotope plutonium-239, today used as the primary fissile material in modern nuclear weapons. But back in the 1960s, the US was still exploring alternatives to traditional uranium-fueled reactors, and one group in particular at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the US state of Tennessee got to work on a peculiar project, a so-called molten salt reactor. Back then, molten salt reactors were mostly known in the US government as byproduct of an embarrassing decade-and-a-half-long attempt to build a nuclear-powered bomber aircraft. Oak Ridge had been responsible for building the reactor for the bomber, but their issues with building a reactor in the conventional style had led to the laboratory investigating other methods of nuclear power generation. At the time, the rapid expansion of nuclear power and the relative lack of naturally occurring uranium around the world had led many within the energy world to fear that uranium would eventually run out, even as back in those days much of the world believed that nuclear energy would be so cheap and abundant that it would be practically free. Via their molten salt reactor, Oak Ridge was able to use the far more abundant thorium to derive uranium-233, and that in turn went back into the reactor to fuel it. By 1969, their thorium reactor was running at full power, and it would spend over 13,000 hours generating energy over the course of the experiment. In one documentary produced about the reactor decades later, nuclear scientist Kirk Sorensen would claim that if the US had continued working with the reactor and taking advantage of the technological gains that came with it, then America might have gone fully energy independent by the year 2000. But alas, it wasn't to be. The reactor was plagued with technical issues, and its handlers couldn't get it to produce nearly as much power as they'd initially hoped. Shutdowns were common, the electrical system was unable to handle the reactor. All told, it was underwhelming. But that alone isn't enough to outweigh the potential benefits of continuing the experiment and figuring out how to use a thorium reactor, and indeed that isn't what doomed the thing. Instead, the starry-eyed optimism around uranium reactors and the new realizations about uranium's abundance were enough to help leading atomic scientists decide that their more developed, uranium-based technology was the way of the future. The uranium fuel cycle was proven. The reactors were already way ahead of where thorium reactors had been at the time, and the clear safety benefits of the thorium reactors were deemed not quite important enough to continue their development. Finally, the death of the thorium reactor was a product of its time. A time when words like non-proliferation could get a person laughed out of a meeting, and when the plutonium produced as part of the uranium fuel cycle was considered absolutely vital to build more nuclear bombs. Thorium reactors wouldn't just fail to produce anything that could go boom, their widespread adoption risked compromising the nuclear weapons supply chain. France would be the only other nation to seriously attempt a thorium reactor in the 20th century, and while their attempt, the Super Phoenix, would operate for over a decade, it was hamstrung by a long series of accidents and technical barriers. Now though, in the 21st century, thorium is back on the table, and in fact, it's fast becoming an international sprint to the finish line. In just a moment, we're going to dive into the status of that race and learn more about how it's going, but first, we've got to understand why there's this race at all. Now, we've run through the basic list of positives related to thorium reactor technology, but now it's time that we dig into the details, where the most obvious asset of thorium over uranium is its abundance. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, some 6.2 million metric tons of the stuff is estimated to be hiding under the Earth's crust. That's about triple the amount of global reserves of uranium, making it roughly as abundant as lead. It's also far easier to get your hands on, with thorium, or also known as monazite, typically containing significant amounts of thorium that can then be purified. It's significantly safer and easier to physically mine than uranium, since thorium mining can take place in open pits. And just as it's safer to mine, it's safer to use in reactors. In fact, thorium reactors, at least as the world currently understands them, cannot suffer a meltdown comparable to what conventional nuclear power plants might experience. No Chernobyl, no Fukushima, no 3 Mile Island. The reactors are built in a way where they can be easily drained of their fuel in case of emergency, and they cannot maintain nuclear reactions after powered mechanisms to stimulate the reaction are no longer functioning. Nor do thorium reactors require any complex lists of input materials. Thorium is all they need once the reaction is initiated. As a fertile isotope, thorium makes everything else that's required to fuel the reactor, and it produces more fissile material than it consumes, meaning that no fissile material has to be introduced from the outside to sustain the reaction once it gets started. Thorium doesn't have to be enriched. Its natural isotope is perfectly capable of producing uranium-233, and according to a Nobel laureate working with the European Organization for Nuclear Research, or CERN, thorium is so efficient that it provides about 200 times the yield of energy for the same amount of substance as uranium. If that figure isn't impressive enough, then fear not, because thorium's kilo for kilo power yield ratio compared with coal is, well, 1 to 3.5 million. Also on the list of problems that thorium could solve is that of nuclear waste. Thorium reactors are estimated to produce somewhere between 1% and 1.1% of the nuclear waste that a uranium fuel cycle reactor would, while again granting a yield of about 200 times as much energy in the process. The waste that it does produce is more stable from the moment it's generated, and it's not as radioactive either. It'll take only a few hundred years at most for the radiation emitting from those sources to drop to safe enough levels that humans can get close to them, as opposed to tens of thousands of years for the nuclear waste that we produce today. Some thorium proponents suggest that byproducts could drop to safe radiation levels after just a couple of decades, maybe even faster. And finally, thorium reactors have little, if any, potential to create byproducts that would be functionally useful in a nuclear weapon. Thorium itself is useless inside a bomb unless it's quite literally dropped onto somebody's head. Uranium-233 is fissile and thus can be used to create a nuclear weapon, but it's an impractical way to create a bomb, even under the best conditions. Thorium reactors do produce some plutonium as a byproduct, but only a small fraction of what conventional uranium reactors produce, and even the plutonium that does come out is woefully unsuitable for use in a bomb. In fact, thorium might even turn out to be a way to get rid of some of the plutonium waste that humanity already has. That same plutonium is useful in starting a thorium reaction, so although thorium reactors aren't a way to burn up all of the excess plutonium the world has, it can at least put a dent in the pile. Other byproducts of uranium-233 that could technically be used to build a bomb are a poor choice to do so, as they give off gamma rays that make them easily traced and tracked, as well as posing a risk to the handlers. Now, make no mistake, thorium reactors, like every other emerging technology, certainly have their naysayers, but the arguments against thorium have much more to do with startup costs and minor trade-offs than any major barriers to widespread adoption. As its detractors often point out, the thorium fuel cycle will require major investment and research before it can be harnessed via modern technology. There is no guarantee of a payoff at the end of all that research, and past attempts to build thorium reactors have been beset by a wide variety of issues. Getting thorium ready for reactor use does cost more than conventional uranium preparation, at least right now, while technologies are still emerging and production lines are not well built. It's pulled from monazite ore that also is used as a source of rare earth elements, demanding changes to current mining practices to prioritize thorium extraction and retention. The heat required to melt thorium oxide and make a thorium fuel poses a challenge when designing the equipment to bring it to that temperature. And one of the byproducts of thorium reactors, the unstable isotope of uranium-232, does emit gamma rays, requiring a different set of measures and mechanisms to keep a reactor's human operators from harm. But each of these barriers is far outweighed by the potential benefits, and much of the world seems to know it. The nation that's put most into thorium reactors across history isn't the USA or Russia or China, but a nation where uranium is scarce, but where the largest thorium supply in the world lurks just underneath its citizens' feet. India kept up research into thorium reactors long after the rest of the world passed it by, and that work has now paid off. Development and testing of promising thorium reactor technology has been ongoing there for a decade, although plans to build and finish a full-scale thorium reactor have yet to be realized. India is pushing hard to achieve large-scale power production via thorium over the course of the next 2 decades or so, and hopes to cover a large proportion of its electricity needs via thorium not long after. India's leaders, both past and present, recognize that their nation is ideally suited to be a leader on thorium-derived nuclear energy, and it's been enshrined in India's civilian nuclear program since the founding father of that program, a physicist named Homi Bhabha, made it a top priority over half a century ago. The country's push for thorium hasn't always been fruitful. Part of the reason that progress has been so slow is that India has refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and is thus iced out of global resources pools that might otherwise have resolved its thorium problems. But in 2024, its prototype fast breeder reactor was finally completed, and it's expected to be operational by the end of this year. And just across a frigid Himalayan border, the nation of China is well on its way to matching, if not outpacing, India within a few short years. China has been working toward a thorium reactor since at least 2011, and like India, China has undertaken the work almost entirely by itself. China, however, had the luxury of doing so by choice. That same laboratory that built a modern salt reactor back in the 1960s, Oak Ridge, has since become one of the few foreign scientific entities to partner with China on that mission. At the time of writing, China has multiple thorium fuel cycle reactors in construction out in the Gobi Desert, and just this year, 2024, China confirmed that one of those reactors will start operating in 2025. That pilot plant will produce only about 2 megawatts of electricity when fully operational, but because of the broader robustness of China's nuclear industry, the act of building a working thorium reactor will probably be more challenging than simply proliferating them later on. China hopes to eventually build numerous thorium plants across its deserts and spread them to dozens of nations involved with its Belt and Road Initiative around the globe. In the United States, after some early whispers of collaboration with China in the 2010s, the drive to build a thorium reactor is still flagging. The idea did pick up some traction in US Congress even before 2010, and in 2020, the US Department of Energy began an initiative to bring 2 prototype next-generation reactors online, with the door wide open to making an attempt at thorium. In 2022, however, Congress introduced a bill entitled the Thorium Energy Security Act, calling for the US to invest in the procurement of uranium-233 with the goal of building a national stockpile and eliminating any potential future dependency on other nations for the stuff. Although that particular bill never made it to a floor vote before either House of Congress, a later bill, signed in 2024, put aside healthy sums of money to gather uranium-233 and called for the development of fuels for use in, quote, future molten salt and high-temperature gas reactor designs. Across the rest of the world, Denmark stands out as a leader on thorium energy, with the company Copenhagen Atomics announcing in 2024 that its molten salt reactor, the Wast burner, is finally ready for a real-life attempt to reach criticality. The waste burner is a small reactor, meant to be packed up and transported in a shipping container if need be, and it uses plutonium derived from spent nuclear fuel to activate and begin the reaction process with fertile stores of thorium. The waste burner is expected to come online for the first time in Switzerland in 2026. Elsewhere, Canada has made some progress toward a thorium reactor, Israel and Japan have shown some interest, and one South African company is working overtime to design a thorium reactor that could alleviate the country's serious energy problems. Indonesia and Norway have each demonstrated some willingness for research and development too. As the race to a commercial thorium reactor really kicks off in the next few years, the nations involved are sure to find reasons to engage in friendly or sometimes quite unfriendly competition. But just like the thorium fuel cycle offers myriad advantages over conventional nuclear power, a thorium technology race promises to be a whole lot less intense than some of the other resource-based competitions around the world. A big part of the reason why has to do with resource availability. According to the World Nuclear Association, India has the world's largest set of thorium reserves, estimated to be 850,000 metric tons. Next is Brazil at 632,000 metric tons, then Australia and the US with 600,000 metric tons each. Egypt, Turkey, Venezuela, Canada, Russia, South Africa, and China are all believed to have 100,000 metric tons of reserves or more, and often much, much more. Unlike, say, cobalt, an incredibly important substance that the world depends largely on the Democratic Republic of the Congo to mine, thorium is available in major reserves across many world nations, but even more important, it's available on both sides of stark geopolitical gaps that only seem to be getting more extreme. Russia, China, and the US have all got substantial reserves of their own. India and Brazil are likely to be very pleased to sell some of their thorium to Russia and China to make up for America's head start. Turkey, along with the Scandinavian nations, can combine to yield 600,000 tons of the stuff or more for the European nations of NATO. Venezuela will be more than happy to sell to Russia, and Egypt likewise to China. Whatever the race to thorium power looks like, it won't look like the current fight over rare earth elements, for example, where one major power, China, controls much of the market. Nor is thorium an area where scarcity is likely to be an issue. At its current levels of power consumption, the United States, for example, is expected to have enough thorium in the ground to power it for the next 1,000 years, after which time, it's true, America would need to explore other options. So, would other world nations in the year 3024 be having intense conversations about what to do when the thorium runs out? Well, by that point, pretty unlikely they're going to be dependent on thorium. It's highly unlikely that in the further future, this is going to be a thing, because the thorium fuel cycle is understood as a bridge technology. Truly next-generation sustainable energy, namely nuclear fusion, aren't expected to yield substantial energy production until around 2050, and more conservative estimates can fall back to 2060 or even 2070. But let's be really pessimistic for a moment and say that fusion won't be scaled up to that level for another century, until the 2120s. Even then, the US, assuming a similar level of energy consumption, will have burned through just 10% of the thorium it already knows about. The same is true for the world's thorium reserves, which are, in aggregate, enough to power several centuries of better, more sustainable, more peaceful nuclear energy before the next energy revolution arrives for the generations that come after ours. Make no mistake, the road to mass adoption of the thorium fuel cycle will be a bumpy one. The technologies involved will still need to mature, and policymakers the world over will need to choose thorium to complement or even replace more time-tested renewable and conventional energy sources. The thorium fuel cycle industry, as it emerges, will have to sustain withering attacks from fossil fuel corporations, conventional nuclear power advocates, and more. And while the multilateral technology race may not be quite so bitter as some of the other ones the world's currently fighting, it certainly won't be easy. But the payoff waiting at the end is one of those potential futures that seems almost too good to be true, except with the distinct possibility of it actually being true. As far as humanity can tell, the thorium fuel cycle does work. It does have concrete promise and potential to meet specific technical thresholds, and if the world can figure it out, then the contentious and often painful slog to fully renewable energy can get a hell of a lot easier. That's a future that we, here at Mega Projects, certainly wouldn't mind becoming real.